스티븐 추 박사님의 기조연설이 있겠습니다. 스티븐 추 박사님은 97년 노벨 물리학상을 수상하셨습니다. 전 미국 에너지부 장관이자 현재 스탠포드 대학교에서 교수로 재직하고 계십니다. 세계적인 에너지 학자이시죠? 스티븐 추 박사님을 모시겠습니다. Now it is time for our keynote speech. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Stephen Chu.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here and to talk about something I care deeply about. The outline of my talk is going to be very simple. I'm going to first talk about some new information on climate change. I will then talk about what the world can do, and with some emphasis on what Korea can do to actually conserve energy through energy efficiency, energy storage, and then mention some of the issues and opportunities that Korea has in its energy mix, nuclear power, what shale gas will do for the world energy, and renewables. And finally, I'll turn to the research that we in the United States are doing, and as you heard, what Korea is investing in. That research is very important because it's that research that will give us new solutions, better solutions than what we have today. So first, let me begin with climate change. This is a record of the land temperature in the world from 1800 to 2011, and the different colors are essentially different studies by various groups. And what it shows is there are many bumps and wiggles. Now let's see if I can. Doesn't matter. You see the bumps and wiggles, but overall the temperature is increasing. Now I want to point out something very important. It's only in the last 35 years that perhaps 75% of the temperature increase over the last 200 years has occurred. And during that time, we have seen some remarkable changes in the weather patterns around the world. This is just one example. In a glacier in Alaska on August 13, 1941, a picture was taken where you have a permanent glacier. And now if you go there in the summertime, more recently, it is no longer there. It's completely melted. But let me also talk about what the average temperature, as measured by satellite, and also this is mostly ground measurements, of the temperature in the northern hemisphere. It turns out you're going to see a record from 1951 to 2011. And so let me begin this movie of this record. And there, at the very beginning of time, you see the average temperature, above average, below average. These are the summer months in the northern hemisphere. And over this time, as you go to 2011, you see that the temperature has shifted dramatically. The average has shifted. The wings have gotten broader. These, again, are just physical measurements over the last 60 years. Now, if you actually look at these measurements, you find that compared to a base time 1950 to 1980, and you ask, what's the chance there will be an extremely hot day in the summer months, June, July, August? There could be this chance of having this extremely hot day of 30% chance of happening could be 70%. But the remarkable thing is the extreme hot days, things that had only 0.2 of a chance of occurring, are now occurring at perhaps roughly 8% of the time. So when you think of the extremely hot summers in the recent past, it's not your imagination. This, over the entire northern hemisphere, has become the rule. And these, again, are measurements over the entire northern hemisphere. This has been changing, and it's going to continue to change. And as a result of that, we have to begin to accept the fact that this is not only going to be continued to change, this is not the new norm, it will continue to shift. As a result of that, the world has seen some heat waves. In August of 2003, over 50,000 people died of a heat wave in Europe, in large part because at that time Europe did not have very much air conditioning, nor did they have experience in dealing with very hot weather. And so this happened also in Moscow in 2010, another extreme heat wave, another tens of thousands of people died, 10, 15,000 people died. Now, if you take all the events of storms, floods, heat waves, droughts, forest fires, things of that nature, and tabulate them from 1980 till 2012, what you find is the following. This is data taken by Munich Re. Munich Re is a reinsurance company. A reinsurance company are companies that insure insurance companies. The reason insurance companies need insurance is if there's a massive flood, a massive hurricane, a drought, they don't have the assets to pay back the premiums, so they take out insurance. As a result of that, the reinsurance companies are quite concerned if the risks over the period of decades is changing, they have to know about this. So Munich Re has been tabulating this data. Now the lower brown that you see at the very bottom are significant earthquakes. And although it's very noisy, there doesn't seem to be any trend. But if you look at all the other things, if you look at storms, tornadoes, hurricanes, cyclones, floods and everything, the trend is that these numbers are increasing. In addition to that, the losses of property are also increasing over this time period, 1980 to 2011. And here you see a trend line. It's very noisy, but the trend line is the losses of insured and uninsured losses is reaching and beginning to exceed $200 billion a year. So this is beginning to be a significant amount of money. But these losses are actually not the full losses, because as I began to ask questions about what was included in these losses, it turns out if you have a massive hurricane, your business is lost business, there's property damage, you can't rebuild, you go out of business. The fact that you are now out of business, your business has been destroyed, doesn't count as a loss. Perhaps just the property damage counts as the loss. And in the United States, after Katrina, but then after Sandy, Irene, and other hurricanes, the insurance on flood insurance could not pay the premiums. The federal government is paying those premiums. The debt on the loss in premiums is now about $26 billion. The interest on that debt will not be paid back by flood insurance premiums. So it becomes a permanent part of the U.S. debt. Okay? Now, Congress has passed a bill very recently that says maybe you should require that the insurance premiums increase, but we'll put a cap on it. They can't increase by more than 25% per year until they pay for itself. But in order to pay for the debt, they're going to increase so much that people will simply not have insurance. In fact, more than half the people who live in flood zones don't have insurance already. And so the solution is not raise the premiums, people just drop out. And when disaster happens, they expect the U.S. government to come in and restore their homes anyway. So this is a problem. And let me tell you another problem that I have to go back to an analogy. This is the use of tobacco in the United States from 1900 to 2005. And on the black curve, you see the consumption of cigarettes on an average of the country per person. As the population increases, the consumption increases, of course, so it's folding in the population increase. So the average consumption of cigarettes, you see, among males climbed and it peaked around 1950, 1960. 20 years later, the number of deaths due to lung cancer also followed a similar curve. By 1970 and 1980, the United States went on a very rigorous campaign to discourage smoking among adults and children, of course. And so the number of cigarette smoking among men decreased. The number of deaths followed 20 years later. Now, unfortunately, women thought it was very fashionable to start smoking, And so women started smoking, and their deaths started increasing similarly. So now, I remember when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, the tobacco companies said there is no direct link between lung cancer and cigarette smoking. There is no microscopic medical understanding of how cigarette smoking can even cause cancer. So why should you worry? Okay. One can say we do not, the climate is very, very complicated. We do not understand the climate, and certainly we cannot predict hurricanes or tornadoes at all. And we may not be able to for the next 10 or even 20 years. But what we do see is a rise in temperature. We understand that rise in temperature. It's due to greenhouse gases. And we see these extreme weather events. So just like you can't predict, some people smoke 1 or 2 packs of cigarettes a day and they never get lung cancer. And other people smoke a little bit and they get lung cancer. You can't really predict. But we can't predict in this region there will be this thunderstorm, this tornado. But in the aggregate, something seems to be happening. And something seems to be happening in a very serious way. All right, now let me talk about how to change this. And this is part of Energy 3.0. The first thing you can do is begin to use the energy we have much more efficiently, much more wisely. As one example, if you look at buildings, where the world spends 40% of its energy on heating or cooling buildings, or also lighting buildings. And when you look at how we design buildings, even today, you can reduce the energy consumption in a building without changing the lifestyle of the building, without lowering the thermostat in the winter or raising it in the summertime. You can have the same comfort level, or even better comfort level, with at least half the energy being, so it's much more energy efficient. You're twice as energy efficient. But if you look at a systems approach to building buildings, so you integrate the heating and air conditioning, you integrate the lighting in the windows, the building materials, and you integrate the whole package, you can make much better roads. But it turns out that many architects, in fact most architects and structural engineers, don't know how to do this. They don't know the existing technologies. And when you look at this, they don't even understand some of the things having to do with natural convection. Long ago, we've discovered that heat air rises, but after energy became very plentiful and very cheap, you can build an air conditioning and heating system that would force air wherever you wanted it to go. But if you use the fact that hot air rises, cold air falls, you can use the natural convection currents in a much more clever way. And again, we're beginning to have to relearn how to do this, but with modern computer technologies, this is something that can be made much more readily available. Let me also describe at the Department of Energy, in one of our programs you'll hear a little bit more about, called ARPA-E. This is Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. We looked at air conditioning. Now in air conditioning, for those of you who don't know, the way air conditioning works is you have a compressor, it's like a big refrigerator, and you chill the air very, very cold. It's so cold that the water moisture comes out of that. And then after you've got the air so cold that the water moisture comes out, you then take that air and you warm it up to whatever temperature you want it to be, really, and then you use it. So you overchill the air in order to get the water out, and then you heat it up again. This is not very efficient. If you look at the primary energy used for cooling, and you look at a theoretical limit, we're about 10 times away from this theoretical, quote, thermodynamic limit. And so what the folks at ARPA-E did, what we did is we looked at it and said, we can do much better with much more radical designs of air conditioning. And we set as a target, we're going to do at least halfway there. And again, because of this, and because we're funding this type of research, it begins to get people to think there might be a radically new way of doing air conditioning. And as the world gets hotter and as the developing world becomes more developed and they have more energy to use, you would want to do this because air conditioning will be a major consumer of electricity in the future. Let me also tell you about another form of both air conditioning and energy storage. This is a picture of the power plant of the Texas Medical Center. This is a consortium of hospitals and research laboratories in Houston, Texas. It's the biggest consortium of medical research in the United States in a single city. And it's in Houston, Texas, where it's very hot, it's very humid. And what they decided to do when they had to expand the power capacity of this hospital city, if you will, could be, in terms of energy consumption alone, in the top 20 cities in the United States, just the hospital unit. And you see that big round tower in orange and white and black. That is a tank of water, 8.8 million gallons of water. What they did is they took a gas turbine that generates electricity, and then with this gas turbine they have some waste heat. They use the waste heat in what's called combined heat and power, except the waste heat was used, it could heat in the wintertime, but they're more concerned about summertime. So they used the process heat to drive an air conditioning unit that cooled a big tower of water. And it turns out that cooling a big tower of water at night, when you need electricity, sometimes you don't want the term process heat. When you want the process heat, sometimes you don't want the electricity. What they decided to do was make a big thermal storage unit so that they could optimize the plant so it's operating at full thermodynamic efficiency, about 85% efficient of the amount of energy turned into either electricity or process heat. And the excess process heat goes to chill water. That water being chilled, to keep that tank of water cold, takes 1/10 the energy than it does to chill. So the thing is optimized, and again, it's a very clever way of energy storage. This has now been in operation for 2 years, and many other people around the world are beginning to look very hard at this way of doing it. It's the biggest district cooling system in the United States. Other efficiencies, airplanes have become much more energy efficient. If you look at the new Boeing 787 and compare it to the first successful commercial jetliner, the 707, you find that the 787 uses only 30% of the fuel of a 707. And yet flies just as fast, a little bit faster, and is bigger. And it's because of aerodynamics, it's because of better engines. The engines per unit of fuel they burn give twice as much thrust, and because of lighter weight materials. Many, many things conspire to do this, but that's also very important. For many countries, I know Korea is very focused on this, and so are we in the United States. If you live in cities or if you live in suburban areas, you can have plug-in hybrids. You can have also entirely electric vehicles. And so when I was Secretary of Energy, we set out a grand challenge. Is it possible to produce a car, a 5-passenger vehicle, that is as affordable as an internal combustion engine car 10 years in the future, where if it costs a little bit more to own this electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid, it would pay for itself in less than 5 years. And so we looked very hard at this and decided this was an achievable goal. It would require many different advances in car manufacturing, lighter weight materials, better motors, and power electronics, but most of all, it would require a better battery. In 2008, when we started this, the manufacturing cost of a lithium-ion battery, the kind that's used in a Nissan Leaf or Chevy Volt, cost about $1,000 per kilowatt hour to manufacture. In 2012, or 2013 today, it costs about $500 per kilowatt hour to manufacture. Most of the people in the industry recognize within 6-8 years it will go down in price another 2-fold. But our goal is to make this price go down 4-fold. And somewhere between 3- and 4-fold, if you look at consumer habits and tastes and what they're willing to pay, one realizes that at that price, at, let's say at $160 a kilowatt hour, even $200 a kilowatt hour, then the electric vehicle or the plug-in hybrid becomes very, very popular because it becomes the lowest form of transportation. Again, you need a range of, let's say, at least 350 kilometers or to 300 miles. Let me talk about another energy efficiency, and this was refrigerators. You see in this picture in 1940 an old refrigerator. It used to be what's called an ice box. Up there in the condenser, there used to be a block of ice, and the cool air, if you will, from the block of ice would be used to cool the inside of the food in the refrigerator. Over the years, this refrigerator improved. They added features. One of the most desirable features is what's called frost-free. And how does frost-free work? Well, it actually takes some air and it heats it up and blows hot air into the freezer section of the refrigerator. That hot air melts a little thin layer of ice, you collect the water, and then you cool it down again. But as you might imagine, if you're blowing hot air into your refrigerator, it becomes very inefficient. And because of that, refrigerators started to consume a lot of energy. So by 1975, the people in California said, these refrigerators are consuming so much energy, we have to do something about it. And they set some state standards that said, if you want to sell a refrigerator in California, it has to be a certain energy efficiency minimum. And from this set of standards, the efficiency started to climb dramatically. If you compare today's refrigerators to the ones in 1975 when the standards started, the refrigerators are 22% bigger. And yet, they actually cost 3 times less to operate, to own and operate, than a 1975 refrigerator. But now you might be thinking, well, all right, they're much more energy efficient. In fact, these refrigerators are more efficient than before you had automatic defrost. They're that efficient. You can still blow hot air in it and still is much more efficient. Better compressors, better insulation, better seals. But you can say, yes, but these refrigerators must cost more money. They're higher technology. And even though the cost of powering the refrigerator is so much less, you're still at an initial purchase price that must have been higher. So what my colleagues and I decided to do was, I'm a scientist, and so rather than saying this must be so, you do something unheard of in economics. You go and look at some data. And so let me explain this curve. The open blue circles are how much it costs to own and operate a refrigerator over the refrigerator lifetime. That's the purchase price plus the cost of energy. The closed blue circles is how much does it own and operate the cost of a refrigerator after standards started to be put in place. Now on the x-axis, you see it goes from 25 to 50 to 100 to 200. Every time you double the number shipped and produced, the cost comes down by a certain fraction, let's say 10%, 3%, 5%. This is what's called the learning curve in economics. Every time you double the production and shipments, the fractional cost goes down proportionally, and so that's how you plot it on this logarithmic graph. The red circles, both open and closed, are the purchase price of the refrigerator. Now, if you stare hard at this data, you'd be hard-pressed to see that the purchase price of refrigerators has gone up. In fact, you might say it seems to have done the opposite. It might have gone down. The trend line of decreasing price might have actually increased. So we looked at not only refrigerators, we looked at 3 other appliances over a 40, 50-year period. There were refrigerators, there were clothes washers. There you see it's unmistakable. The same clothes washer, the purchase price of the clothes washer, the more efficient clothes washer actually, the trend line actually increased. So it was getting cheaper faster. It's also true of room air conditioners. It's also true of central air conditioners. It's also true in Europe. So regulation did somehow the exact opposite. By saying you have to make a more efficient unit, you actually stimulated the engineers to think harder about what they were designing. And what you ended up having is not only a more energy efficient appliance, you had something that was less expensive. Right? So this is how you can, this is Energy 3.0, appliances in electric motors, in everything, in TVs, in refrigerators. Now let me talk about Korea's energy options. Well, unfortunately, Korea does not have the energy assets of the United States. We have lots of oil, we have lots of natural gas, we have lots of coal, we have lots of wind resources, we have lots of solar resources. And so most of your energy is actually imported. This is the entire energy, just not electricity. So your petroleum, which is 42% of your energy, is now being quickly diverted to only transportation energy because it's just too costly. And for that reason, your actual use of petroleum and your petroleum imports have actually flattened over the last decade or more. Very, very good, because it's very expensive. But your use of fossil fuels has increased and your use of nuclear has increased. Now, this is your consumption demand of natural gas. It has steadily risen over the last years from 2000 to 2011. Quite alarming because, as you know, currently natural gas is mostly tied to oil prices, very volatile, but the overall trend line for oil and gas prices is much more likely to go up than go down. And then as these prices go up, it creates much more burden on your economy. Now, in the United States, we've made some technological progress, actually starting 30, 40 years ago, in both horizontal drilling and the ability to fracture rock with water, called hydraulic fracking. And this has transformed the United States gas industry. The natural gas in the United States is now at record lows. It's about $4 a million BTU. For a while, due to, in fact, an oversupply, it was at $3. Where traditionally, let's say in Europe and in Asia, natural gas is probably $15, $18 a million BTU. In the United States, it's $4. It's going to likely remain $4 to $6 in the next couple of decades. And so, and as you know, the United States used to be a gas importing nation. It has begun to, it's essentially zero now. And in the future, it will probably slightly export natural gas. But there's some other news. If you look at the rest of the world, it's just not the United States and Canada that has shale gas that can be economically recovered. It happens that it's in many places around the world. Now, you can't read all these small numbers, so let me help you. If I can't read them from here, maybe. But in the United States, the amount of shale gas proven and unproven reserves are estimated to be an additional 664 trillion cubic feet. The most important thing is that that is about a 39% increase in the natural gas reserves. Now, this number has a lot of uncertainty to it, but over the last couple of years, that number has been increasing as the technology for shale gas is improving. But there are many numbers out there, so let me warn you. But that's just in the United States. In the rest of the world, you have, it's an estimated 10 times the potential reserves of shale gas. These are not proven reserves because there's been very little actual extraction of shale gas outside the United States. But this is suspect to be this amount. And so, again, this is suspect to be perhaps increasing the gas supply, the natural gas supply in the world, by as much as 49%. Could be higher, could be lower. But this is good because if this turns out to be true, or if even if it's halfway true, the whole pricing of natural gas will probably be broken from oil. And it will have a price of its own, so to speak. Very important because China suspect to have lots of shale gas, potential shale gas supplies as well. And so this is good news in the sense that shale gas, because there's actually potentially other sources around the world, for the next tens of years, this could be used as a transition fuel, a relatively inexpensive transition fuel, and you can come away from coal until we learn to use coal in a cleaner way. Now, but this shale gas, and in the United States shale oil as well, is led one to really think about this. And here I want to quote one of my favorite authors. And they said, our ability to find and extract fossil fuels continues to improve, and economically recoverable reservoirs around the world are likely to keep pace with the rising demand for decades. That was said by myself and Aruma Jandar in an 8-page, one of my favorite authors, in an 8-page Nature article we wrote in 2012. All right, but how does this reflect on climate change, this very, very serious issue that we have to deal with? And I quote Sheikh Ahmed Yami, a former Saudi oil minister, who said, the Stone Age came to an end not for the lack of stones, and the oil age will come to an end, but not for the lack of oil. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, what we really meant is that you transition to better solutions. And a better solution is not only an environmentally cleaner solution, it's also a better solution economically as well. And that's the most important thing. It's both of those things. So in the Department of Energy, when I came to the Department of Energy, I was given the responsibility and the joy of starting a new form of funding called ARPA-E. This is, again, Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy. And its whole philosophy was that instead of funding incremental improvements on existing technologies, we wanted to fund work that will lead to disruptive technologies. We did not want to fund long-term research that could only perhaps pay off 10 and 20 years from today, but we wanted to fund things that had a possible short time horizon, a few years, to get interest in the private sector investments, or it would be stopped. And so in this orange curve, you see a current learning curve. As you get better and better at this, the source of energy or any technology decreases in time. But we wanted to fund things that today would be much more expensive and don't look practical, and many of those things would fail. But what we were really looking for was a new trend line, a new learning curve, a totally radical approach. And so we expected things to fail. In fact, if half of them succeeded, we knew we were not funding the right things. But we want a few home runs. If all of them failed, we know we're not funding the right things. But the point is, you have to fail and fail fast and move on. In my research career over 35, 40 years, I actually started research directions or projects, and maybe 3/4 of them failed. But I didn't spend 5 years failing. I would spend a month failing and then move on. And so that meant you can try a lot of things until you find something that succeeds. And so that is, in many scientists, most of the scientists I know who have done reasonably well, their attempt rate is higher. Their ratio of failure to success might not be any better, but they get to try more things. The other thing that was heavily influenced the way we designed ARPA-E was my experience at Bell Laboratories. I worked at Bell Laboratories for 9 years. I went there officially on leave of absence from being an assistant professor at Berkeley. I didn't teach a course. They allowed me to leave my first year to gain some experience because I spent all my time growing up at Berkeley. And so I went to Bell Laboratories, and the remarkable thing about Bell Laboratories is that 17 people who worked there went on to get Nobel Prizes. That in itself is pretty good, but you also have to understand that Bell Laboratories never hired established scientists. They always hired scientists fresh out of PhD or postdoc. That means it's before they did their Nobel Prize work. And so that makes it even better. And one of the most remarkable things about Bell Laboratories is the total openness and honesty and a willingness of the scientists to stick their nose into everything. And there were very many animated discussions in seminars and in lunchtimes and in tea rooms where someone described this as constructive confrontation. You may not be an expert in this field, but you're listening and you say, well, I don't understand this. It doesn't make any sense to me. Can you explain this? That's the polite way. Some other people would say it less politely. What the hell are you trying to do that kind of stuff for? But it wasn't meant personally, which is the most important thing. It wasn't attacking the person. It was to explain, defend your position, your point of view, but it's not a point of view, it's science. And then you'd go to the blackboard and you'd talk about this. And this is something we were able to establish at ARPA-E. There's an idea, the program director wanted to go in a certain direction. All the other program managers said, well, I don't think that's a good direction. They don't say it's not my business. I'll just politely sit and listen. You make your case and I'll make my case. Each of them was told to speak up and get a discussion going and challenge and run to a whiteboard or a blackboard and discuss it in real time, then and there. And it's in that atmosphere that you can actually decide what to fund, what not to fund, what programs to start, what not to start. And it was the exact same as where I grew up at Bell Laboratories. this is me before my phase change. I'm showing you 5 scientists who were hired within a 3-year period. All of us were hired as youngsters, either fresh out of graduate school. Me, I was fresh out of postdoc. All of us looked even younger than that, but some of those pictures were taken. But the point is, out of 40 people hired in a 3-year period, 5 of them went on to get Nobel Prizes in this little hunk of time. Okay? Again, we were all young people. We all worked nights and weekends, and we all talked to each other, and we all egged each other on, and we were also telling each other about our opinions of their work and helped each other. So that's a magical place. Now, out of this grows research programs. In RPE, we looked at, for example, renewable energy, wind, solar, intermittent. If you want to have renewable energy be 30, 50, 80% of the world's energy supply 50 years from today, you need energy storage. There's no question about it. And you need very inexpensive energy storage. So what the folks at RPE did is they looked at all the technologies for what are the qualities of energy storage you need for utility scale energy storage. They gathered workshops, they decided what might be possible, and then they put out an announcement opportunity, a funding announcement opportunity, and said, this is what we want, this is the price we want it at. You're going to have 2 and 2.5 years to deliver on this. Most of you are going to fail, but take a shot at it. And this is one example of how we did this. It not only is it cost, but it had to have many other qualities. Electrical efficiency, it would have to last at least 5,000 cycles. 5,000 cycles is 10 years. And 10,000 cycles is 30 years. So utility scale lifetime. And it had to be scalable to handle the night-day load shifting that utility companies wanted. Now, we don't know whether this is going to work or not. There are a number of companies doing this. This is one attempt, a company called EOS, which, again, I actually have not, I'm planning to visit them, but they're now claiming that they have a technology that, when scaled properly, would cost $160 a kilowatt hour. They claim they've already demonstrated 10,000 cycles of deep discharge, which is 30-year lifetime, and 75% round-trip efficiency. Now, even if it's half as good, this is very good. But this is what's happening. There are about half a dozen companies that are looking at radical new approaches to battery technology, and candidly, over the last dozen years, when I've been looking at this over the last dozen years, I've seen more progress over the last 5 years than I have over the last 30 years. Very good ideas, and something is bound to happen. So while I was in the Department of Energy, we had other things. We had Sunshine, revitalization of a photovoltaic program, EV Everywhere, the inexpensive 300-mile car. RPE, a new funding that looks for transformational transformations. And I told my people over and over again, as I told my graduate students and postdocs when I was directing my research group, I'm going to get a quote from a favorite of mine, and it's, the greater danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. That was said by Michelangelo. And that is something we really tried to stress in the Department of Energy and in RPE, and also in my own research group. Now, let me very briefly talk about nuclear power in Korea. I think nuclear safety is something that can be continuously improved on. Even if you have existing reactors, we in the United States continually make small modifications to those reactors and continually make safety improvements. You have to have an independent, very competent technically, and trusted regulatory oversight, because once that trust is broken, you have to earn it back, and it's hard, but it's very important. Part of that is we found after 3 Mile Island that the operator proficiency is very important. Just as airlines found it's very important that pilots actually practice flying planes for real. There's a danger now in today's modern airplanes. You flip it on autopilot and then you forget about it. And there have been incidents that have occurred over the recent past where that was a danger. And what you have to do is you have to constantly subject your airline pilots, and your nuclear reactor operators to simulator drills of emergencies several times a year, so that they actually get so practiced. It's like a fire drill when we were young children. We would march out of the high school or grade school and march quietly out into the yard in a pretend fire drill. And you do this several times a year, only so that when it really happens, you don't panic. And so similarly, for airline pilots and for nuclear operators, very, very important, have very realistic simulators that simulate accidents, simulate mishaps, and teach the operators how to respond. During an accident, you can't really go to a manual, nor can you radio headquarters and ask the CEO of United Airlines, do I put the nose down or do I pull the nose up? Because my airplane is falling out of the sky. All right, so now there's this story that is hit internationally, this falsification of certification records. And that's bad news. But I should also say, when I read these stories, that's also good news. It was found before an accident occurred. Usually, you find that records were falsified after the accident occurred, and they go sniffing around, and they find, oops. So the good news is, someone was checking before it occurred, and you have to do more of that. This occasionally happens in the United States. The United States is not immune to this. There's a temptation to falsify records. It's cheaper. And again, a trusted regulatory agency is very important. Now, let me very briefly mention the safety of energy sources. Not every energy source is perfect. In fact, most of them have flaws one way or the other. But if you ask a simple question, how many people die from a number of terawatts of electricity generated? From accidents, from exposures, from this or that, it turns out for every person that dies from a nuclear incident or from an estimated incidence of cancer or with something like that, it turns out that there are 900 coal-related deaths, 4,000 coal-related deaths and 900 oil-related deaths per one nuclear death. That doesn't include what might happen in climate change. It just includes mining accidents, respiratory illnesses, those things. Another thing not commonly known is that the amount of radioactivity released in a standard operation of a nuclear power plant is 1/100th the amount of radiation released for the same amount of power generated in a coal plant. Because when you burn coal, you release thorium and radium. Now, don't get excited. The thorium and radium released in a coal plant is not dangerous to your health. It's a very low level. But just to put it in perspective, all energy sources have warts. Wind, you do have wind resources. Unfortunately, they're in the southern part and they're offshore. And one of the issues in offshore wind is the maintenance costs. If you need to service a giant wind turbine when you have rough seas, it becomes very costly. The salt air is also very corrosive. This is a major effort going along all over the world to try to make these wind turbines work as well as on land. In land in the United States, the wind turbines the cost of generating electricity in the United States in wind and good sites is about the same. It's cheaper than coal, and it's a little bit more, maybe 10% more expensive than natural gas, new natural gas, at our very low prices of $4 a million BTU. This is just to remind you that if you want to service a very heavy nautical or gearbox in a wind turbine that weighs tens of tons, it's very hard to do this if you're on a boat. But you don't have to do it on a boat. You can actually get a crane, as seen these cranes strapped to skyscrapers, that they use the skyscraper as the platform that makes the stand on the crane sturdy. And you can do a similar thing. You have a very strong tower, wind tower, that you can hook a very flimsy crane structure, so then the crane can go up, walk up, lift down the things, lower it down to the ship, and replace it. Again, it hasn't been done yet, and I give this to you free of charge, because I think it should actually be this. Europe, which has, I think, 6 gigawatts of wind, still do it by servicing from a boat, but these are now 100-meter tall towers, and once the seas are 2 or 3 feet, you can't service it anymore. So when the turbine goes out, it could be out for months before you can service it. Something not generating electricity for months is very costly as a business. All right, let me mention, I'm closing near the end, power conversion, power electronics. Again, something we decided in the Department of Energy is a small investment can go a long way. And so what we realized is if you use higher frequencies to step up voltages, instead of being in 50 or 60 hertz, you go to 50 or 60 kilohertz, the size of the transformers decreases roughly as inverse of the frequency. So if you're at 1,000 times higher frequency, you have 1,000 times smaller transformer. And so our dream several years ago was it possible to build a transformer that used to weigh 70,000 pounds and make it weigh 100 pounds using very different transistors, so-called wide bandgap transistors, not made of silicon, but made of silicon carbide or gallium nitride. And then my last year as head of the Department of Energy, we had an RPE summit, and a company came, and a sales representative, engineer came in a car, rented car, and he picked up a suitcase, and he dumped it there, and that was the 70,000-pound transformer in that little suitcase. Right? So why do you want something like that? Well, you want it for a number of reasons. First of all, most of the electricity in the future will be going through this power electronics, converting AC to DC, DC to AC, stepping up in voltage, stepping down in voltage. I'm going to skip this. This is too complicated. And just let me say that we started in RPE, especially, started investing in companies and in research groups that would make higher power, higher voltage transistors. And this has come to fruition now. The latest news is already in testing in one company called Cree. There's a single transistor that can switch 1 megawatt, the size of a fingernail. And so those transistors could be used to step up voltages for AC to DC conversion. They're used in wind turbines already to make them much more efficient, so they can turn at variable speeds, many instances. And let me impress upon you how important it is to have high voltage electronics, high power electronics. In the little cartoon on the left, you see a DC transmission line. You need 2 wires. And that tower is the same size as you need on the thing on the right for AC transmission lines. And it turns out once you go further than 500 kilometers, it's cheaper to move energy DC than AC, as long as it only goes from one point to another point, because it costs a lot of money to step up in voltage and to step down in voltage. But once you have high power electronics in a very different generation, and that becomes cheaper, then you can envision lots of DC lines. The other point of DC lines is you can put them under the water, and you can put them underground. AC lines, because the alternating electric fields create magnetic fields that couple to the earth conductor, which means then you have losses. And that's why transmission lines, the higher the power, the higher they are up in the air. They're not up there so you can't touch them, because believe me, not many of you are 300 feet tall. The reason they're so high is because they're coupling to the ground. And the alternating currents are same magnetic fields that couple to the ground. DC lines can be put in the ground or underwater. Those lines are that are DC lines either being planned or built in Europe to trade energy back and forth. And once you have that, Korea can now think of putting DC lines in the shallow waters to get it from the south of Korea to Seoul without disturbing lots of people along the way. But it requires better electronics. And so this is, again, something this group of people decided this is something ripe for development, and so we are developing that as well. And we're beginning to see the efforts. So let me conclude by going back to the first image, and it's one of my favorite pictures. It was taken by the first mission of Apollo that went around the moon in preparation for the moon landing, taken in Christmas Eve, 1968. I was an undergraduate student at the time. And in the last of the orbits around, they turned the capsule to the Earth, and one of the astronauts took this picture called Earthrise. And in this picture, you see the lunar landscape, and off in the distance, a very inviting Earth. And you should take away several messages. First, if you look at the moon, it's not a pleasant place to live. Look at Earth, it looks pretty good from that distance. It looks pretty good up close, too. And you notice there's nowhere else to go. And you should remember that as we think about how to transition to a sustainable energy future. Thank you.
스티븐 슈 박사님의 인사이트 넘치는 기조 강연이었습니다. 참고로 이 기조 연설 자료는 저희 행사 홈페이지에서 받아보실 수 있습니다. Thank you, Dr. Chu. And for your information, this keynote presentation is downloadable from our website.